Curtis. Welcome to the Traipsin Global on Wheels podcast hour.
Hello.
Bruce Curtis is a disability rights activist who uses a wheelchair, worked for the World Institute on Disability for 22 years, and served as an international program director until June of 2014. From 1992 to 2004, Mr. Curtis worked in Russia and other post-Soviet countries. From 2004 until 2017, he was building the capacity of the Coalition for Independent Living in the Republic of Georgia and managed a USAID 5-year project to create a factory producing Roughrider wheelchairs, to train occupational therapists, to provide postural support seating services, to conduct a public education campaign on promoting a barrier-free environment. Currently, he is the chairperson of Whirlwind Wheelchair International. Welcome, Bruce.
Well, thank you, Ming.
So with that, let's proceed. Let's gain an understanding of your personal background. So I understand that you were in a diving accident when you were 17. Could you describe how that changed your life? And by having a disability suddenly, what opportunities did it take away and what opportunities did it create?
As all disabled people know, at least those who become disabled in their lives, a sudden major accident that changes our bodies, changes our lives, has very deep impact, and that seems obvious to many people, but nobody knows what that impact is until you experience your life, until you see where your life goes and what choices you make. And I think I'm pretty much the same. At 17, we're still figuring out who we are as people, as adults that we will become, and it took me several years, quite a few years actually, like many other people, to settle down in terms of the fact that I was a disabled person. And this is at a time in the 1960s in the United States. And many people believe that the 1960s was a very important time for the beginning of change for disabled people in the United States. It was a time of social changes for women and for minorities as they claimed their civil rights. But as a young disabled person, I was still trying to figure out how to get through college and how to go to college when schools were not accessible. And in the United States today, this is not the situation. Many young people growing up today are familiar with how accessible many cities are. Cities especially have been made much more accessible. In the 60s, it didn't exist. There was not ramps. There were not accessible elevators taking you where you need to go. Going to school required it was on the individual to figure out how they're going to get to their classes. And that means if I was scheduled to go to a class on the third floor of a building and they don't have elevators, then I had to figure out how to ask people to haul me up steps, pull me in a wheelchair up. And as a young adult, that's never something you're happy about doing. It's always problematic. And I struggled through it like everybody does. And you find people, you just start speaking up because you want to get class. I got through college first in an inaccessible college. Then I went to a school where there was accessibility. Finished up my bachelor's and then go through master's program in sociology. I eventually got to a place by the time I was about 24, 25. I'm just finishing college.
Just following up from that previous question, what was it like growing up with a disability for you here in the U.S.? I think many of us, especially those of us who are millennials, have a lot to learn from advocates, and activists like you who've paved the road really for the progress that we've seen today. Can you share with us your experience of growing up with a disability and the early challenges that you faced?
The experience of being in a wheelchair, there's two elements of this. One is being in a wheelchair, but the other, I am a quadriplegic, meaning I broke my neck, and therefore was paralyzed mostly from the chest down. But it also means I don't really have functional hands, and I have weak arms. So there's more to it than just being in a wheelchair. There's the whole problem of navigating life. How do you deal with? How does one deal with their body? How does one live? Do you live independently on your own? Do you live with parents? Do you live with somebody else? How do I develop my social life as a person in a wheelchair when people in wheelchairs are incredibly rare to see in society and see out in society? So these were challenges I faced growing up, trying to figure out how to function and how to create a social life of friends, of significant people you get involved with. I mean, this doesn't happen automatically or easily, and it just becomes more difficult when you have a major disability that makes other people stand away from you. Most people are good, and they are interested. They're curious about other people. This is something I think we all experience. But able-bodied people are not familiar with severely disabled people and how to be friends with them or to how to be open and friendly. So the burden is often on the disabled person to figure it out, to close that distance with the able-bodied people around you. I went about this, I think, like how everyone else does. You just try.
Those are great insights. What advice would you give able-bodied people to enable the interactions to be less awkward and just bridging the gap between, what appears to be different, drastically different physically?
The dilemma, how to bridge the gap between most able-bodied people and a disabled person in a wheelchair is an ongoing experiment in our lives. There isn't a solution for this. It's just an ongoing effort that has to be made by both sides. As a disabled person, I need to show that I am open and friendly and not going to bite people's heads off if they say hello or if they express an interest in who am I. I think most disabled people get tired of explaining their disability to other people, but you have to do it because that's a part of human curiosity. And for the able-bodied people, my advice to them is to recognize that their own humanity, their own complexity as a human being is very much the same with disabled people. We are also human beings. We are complex, and we find ourselves struggling with our bodies to live in this world and to make a good life. So we have lots in common. Able-bodied people should recognize that common humanity that we share, and not be afraid to say hello, strike up a conversation, and find out if they enjoy getting to know me or not. You don't have to look at a disabled person as your potential marriage partner. That's a burden and an obstacle much too soon. It's about starting as friends.
That's a great point. So going back to, the physical challenges of a wheelchair user, what kind of wheelchair do you use?
Almost all my life, I've used a manual wheelchair, and purposefully so. Many quadriplegics have no choice. They have to use an electric wheelchair. Not all, but many. And as a young male, I was interested in being in a manual wheelchair for various reasons. One, an electric wheelchair is a huge piece of equipment, complex, heavy, difficult to move around. You need a lot of equipment, to successfully be independent with an electric wheelchair. And in those days, in the 1960s, in the 1970s. Electric wheelchairs were not very exciting and not very dependable to a huge degree. So a manual wheelchair is just simpler to work with, easier to get around in the world with, gives you many more options for going places and doing things with everybody else in this world, especially in a non-accessible world.
That's fascinating to hear. What kind of wheelchair malfunctions do you get with your chairs over the years? And how would you handle these malfunctions?
Wheelchairs have gone through some changes over the years. I mean, I can speak for my lifetime, which goes from 1960s until now, which is almost 50 years. The wheelchairs I was using, like we were the same as everybody else had it in the 1960s, 1970s. Everybody had just the standard Everston Jennings type manual wheelchair, to use to get around in. And this chair is not it's not the best wheelchair out there. Usually heavy, difficult to push, and when it breaks, when it would break, whether it's me or I think to other people too, you have to figure out a way to fix it. I think that's where your question is going. What do you do when your wheelchair breaks? And in the United States, our answers to that we had a few more options. But again, every individual had to figure out their own solution. It's not like there were wheelchair repair shops existing that in our cities. You do it with your friends who help you figure out how to patch a tire or replace a tire that's gone flat. If you can't do it by yourself, your solutions are almost always your friends, who you know, and who has the skills to be able to help you solve that problem. If it's a bicycle flat tire, that's not a huge problem. If it's a broken piece of equipment, that is a huge problem. You have to learn how to where to go. To find somebody who has the welding equipment that would work with your wheelchair.
So how have you, do you take a wheelchair repair kit with you? And do they give you any hassle? Do you do a carry-on or check-on? How do you transport your tools?
For people who are paraplegics, meaning they have normal arms and normal hands use, then you can think more in terms of doing your own repair work. And carrying hand tools and patch repair kit, and, to do the minor stuff. When you don't have your own hands, then you still want to carry have some tools and materials with you, because you can ask someone else to do it for you, to help you fix something, either your friends or even a stranger. You've got to have the tools and the materials. And then you try to communicate to somebody else how to fix it if it can be done by themselves, or even if you go to a repair place, sometimes they don't have the right materials or tools, and it's better if you bring it with you. So I don't bring a lot with me, but I have learned it's good to have a wrench, for being able to tighten down loose bolts. Like in your front wheels and your axle sockets. It's good to have a tire repair kit with you, which I carry with me, so I don't have to go looking for those, for those materials to fix a flat. These they don't take up a lot of room, but they become a part of my packing of my suitcase when I travel. I have traveled without anything, without any kind of repair equipment or tools, and most of the times it's not a problem. It's those times when it is a problem and you don't have it, and then you go, oh, I should have brought it with me. So, there's not a specific solution for this. It's like, what amount of preparation makes you feel comfortable enough to go risking the unknown out there when you go travel? Because when you travel, it's really...
With that, we're going to transition onto the next section, which is your international work, your international disability rights work. So what ignited your passion to devote your whole life to international disability advocacy and activism work?
There are two elements to that. One is, who am I as a person and what interests me? And I've always been interested in the world and internet, and in what is going on in other countries. That has been a personal curiosity and interest of mine, and I therefore, like many people, I follow in the news what is going on in other countries, politically, socially. I was motivated, by who I am as a person. But in the United States, there was another aspect to what motivated me. In big beginnings in the late 70s, in the United States about the disability civil rights movement, there has been a growing numbers of disabled advocates, of programs, of services. In the 80s, this was still just starting. When we get to the end of the 80s, we in America, we started experiencing the benefits of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which further deepened the rights and laws and regulations that supported disabled people in our, to participate in our society and be in our communities and have a life and have a job and have a family. But that again was more in the late 80s when that came to be. In the 1970s and 80s, while this was going on, I was curious about what was happening for disabled people in other countries, what they were doing to organize themselves to demand their civil rights and their human rights in their countries, and to share the experiences that were coming out of this movement in the United States, to share it with other disabled people and share the tools, the community change, the social change tools that were being developed in the United States for passing laws, passing regulations, developing services, implementing services, organizing the community, organizing the disability movement in society, taking these tools and taking them to another country and sharing these tools with emerging disabled leaders in other countries.
Thank you for that. That was very insightful. So I understand you've done some work in Iraq with the World Institute on Disability. Could you describe the details of your work there and how you trained Iraqis with disabilities to advocate for their rights?
Like all my efforts for the first time, and this was the first time I ever went to Iraq, and this was in, oh my gosh, when was that? Early 2000s, I think. 2006 maybe, somewhere around there.
2008?
2008, yeah, okay. 2008. So the war in Iraq had been going on for about 6 years. No, not that long, 5 years or so. But the war, it wasn't, a war is, most people have an image of a war as, everybody shooting everybody else wherever you are. In Iraq, I was also concerned about flying into and being in Iraq. And in this case, the training was done in the north of Iraq, in an area where the Kurds have where it's primarily the ethnic minority that's there is the Kurdish people. And it was peaceful there. The war wasn't happening in the north of Iraq. It never touched it at all. It was like off bounds, off limits. The U.S. Army was keeping it defended and safe from the war. So the training I did was not in a war zone, but the people that I worked with, which is probably about 30, let's call it about 30 disabled people, they were brought from different parts of Iraq, and they represented all the different the different ethnic groups. So we spent a week. I spent a week in a training sessions all day long with these just young emerging disabled leaders, and ran them through a series of how do you organize, what are your rights, how do you develop a community services, what do they look like, how to work together and develop these kinds of plans. This was about a week-long training. It was the first time they had ever been exposed to this kind of thinking and this kind of discussion. And I was proud. I was very proud of being able to be there and do this. It just doesn't happen that often for disabled leaders in countries that are in war to be able to receive this kind of information and learn these kinds of skills. So I felt modestly successful in completing that. But unlike some other places I have been, that was more like a one-time effort. It didn't have follow-up activities, and I have always preferred to spend a lot of time in a country working with the disability leadership, with the disability organizations, because I've learned it takes a lot of time. It takes several years of being trained and experiencing your skills and your tools and your efforts to change society, to learn how to use these tools and how to grow into being a good disabled leader. So I've preferred to work in one country for many, many years. So most of the time I have preferred to work like in Russia or in the Republic of Georgia or in Nicaragua, where I have done I've spent extensive time with working with people and training them and developing their skills and bringing resources to them so that they could practice those skills and build a more integrated country, for themselves.
So what progress did you make in Iraq? What opportunities did you create for disabled Iraqis through your work in this country?
So the effect that I had in Iraq was pretty minimal. I can speak more to what has happened or changed in Russia, what has happened and changed in Georgia, what has happened in Nicaragua, where I've spent much more time.
So from your limited exposure to Iraqis with disabilities, what are some of the biggest challenges they face?
Like many countries in the world today, disabled people and their organizations, when developing countries that are out there, but also it still applies to the United States, it still applies to Europe and developed countries as well. Most disabled people and their organizations work in isolation. Isolation doesn't mean completely by yourself. It just means you do not have the communication linkages, you don't have the cooperation, you don't have the collaboration going on between the organizations. There's still often too much infighting between the different disability groups. They're not working together. They're working against each other for their own interests, and for the money the minimal amount of money that is available as a resource. There's often struggle to get it.
So now moving on to your work in Nicaragua, Russia, and other countries, I want to do a little comparison here. How does your work in Nicaragua and Russia compare to your experience in Iraq? Is it more or less difficult? What are the similarities and differences when teaching people with disabilities to fight for their rights?
There are similarities for disabled people in each of those three countries, whether it's in Russia, Nicaragua, or Iraq. There are the shared similarities of isolation, lack of resources, lack of collaborative partnerships with other disability organizations, a society that still functions with negative stereotypes about disabled people. And so all three of these countries have that general problem, have those types of general problems. But each of those countries has a different history and a different cultural environment and political government and access to resources. Each of them are different. I learned how ignorant I was about Russia by going there, knowing nothing about the country. In Russia, it has a disability history in Russia is very unique in the world. It has the disability organizations in Russia were started to be created in the 20s and 30s while it was going through major political upheaval and while the Soviet system was being put in place throughout the country. and they experienced World War II and had lots of disabled people from World War II, just like America did. American disability rights movement really started kicking off and changing as society changed after World War II in America. In Russia, they continued developing disability organizations in isolation from society. There is this very focused development of disability organizations completely separate and isolated from the general society in Russia. So what was shocking to me is you have this vibrant economy that seems normal, but the disability world is actually separate and hidden from general society. It's never talked about in the press, never talked about on television. All its rules, supports, and services are like a completely self-contained world, separate from normal society. And that was a first-time experience for me, to see the disability world not as a fragmented, isolated world, which is where it is in almost all countries, but as a well-developed world, but completely in a bubble inside society. There is no accessible transportation. There is no accessible cities. So for people who are severely disabled, they stay in their homes, or they live out their lives in institutions. So they are invisible to society because they're not out in society.
But you said it's developed and vibrant.
Correct. There are resources given by the state to disability organizations. One of the unique things that happened in Russia was disability organizations started from almost their beginnings, where disabled leaders had to learn two different types of skills. They had to learn how to manage the support services that were available for disabled people from the government. In other words, the government provides resources, it provides support, provides services only for disabled people. And so a disability leader needed to understand those government programs and services and be a manager of them to the disabled community. But the other thing that the disabled leaders had to do was figure out how to create a commercial business that would bring in income, that would hire disabled people in those businesses and give them jobs and provide some income or bartered goods, because these disability businesses would make goods, and in the Soviet system, instead of using money, there would also be barter between organizations and cities, and your company makes this kind of products. I need this other thing from you. I can give you my product. Will you give me these services? That kind of exchange went on, and I was shocked to find out that these disability organizations, which had tens of thousands of people, Russians, in them, that the disabled leaders were also running businesses in order to gain income and resources to support those businesses. I was shocked to find out there was like 15,000, 20,000 businesses run by the national disability organizations, and their leadership. I had never seen this in the world, where a disabled leader had to not only figure out how to be a disability leader and manager, but you also had to figure out how to run a commercial business. You had to do both.
That's fascinating.
And that's the way the system grew inside Russia, and it was handled separate from society. It was almost like you have support services, you have programs, you have businesses, you have jobs, but it's all within the disability community by itself. The government did not feel any responsibility for opening up the rest of society. It took care of disabled people through its programs or its state institutions. Many disabled people were given up for adoption by their parents. When they became disabled, they would be born with a severe disability, or they would acquire a severe disability as a kid, and the government, the state in Russia, would say, "Hey, you can't take care of your kid. Look what you don't have the resources." But the state does. Give up your kid to an orphanage, basically, and the state will provide. And so many Russian parents did this, and there are today in Russia many state institutions or we would call them orphanages, where up until the age of 18, disabled people live there, young people live there, go to school, sort of, get some education, sort of, in their schools. It's very inferior. And when they turn 18, they're considered an adult, and they are turned out on the street, basically. And some of those adults stay in institutions because they don't know how to survive by themselves, and they don't have the ability to survive by themselves. So there are many institutions still existing in Russia, even while there is this slowly emerging disability rights, disability integration movement happening in Russia today. From the work that I did over 10 years in Russia, setting up a disability rights organization in Russia, which still is operating today. It has almost 70 staff people in that organization. It's based in Moscow, and it does excellent work throughout a large part of Russia.
What's the name?
The name of that organization is called Perspectiva, which is a Russian word for like perspective. It's just choice of names for organizations in Russia are slightly different than what Americans do. You'll see organizations called Hope, charity. I mean, people pick names for various reasons. This one, they call themselves Perspectiva for perspective, because what is your perspective about society? What is your perspective about disabled people? What is your perspective about the rights of people? It's a way of describing both the problem and the solution.
I see. So you mentioned in one article that, and I quote, "I see situations of revolution, upheaval, or regime change as opportunities to make a better deal with the government, make more things possible." So how and why are situations of revolution, upheaval, or regime change an opportunity to make a better deal with the government? Can you give us a vivid example of how that has held true in your experience?
In Nicaragua, this was 1980-81. They had just had the Sandinista revolution. They had a government in power promising equality and human rights for all citizens and all people, a country for all people, including poor people. That's why there was a lot of excitement and at the possibility of a new future. In Russia, I went there right after the fall of the Soviet Union, immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, like a year after it stopped existing, precisely because I had learned that when governments go through a major change, new people, new ideas, they want to think about rearranging society and how it functions. That's when there is a moment to start talking to government people and people who control regulations and who control resources about starting a new vision for their country and their society. And they are willing to listen to it because that's the historical moment going on. They want to change their country. They want to do things in a different way. And I am there speaking up for disabled people as an international person, and having access to government people and people of power, because one, I'm a novelty as an international disabled person, And because I'm familiar with how to make and get those kinds of meetings with people. So I'm speaking to people in power about how to change their society and what's necessary to make that happen. In Nicaragua, both in Nicaragua and in Russia, the beginnings of those changes was creating disability-run organizations that shared this vision for transforming society. You have to create an organization that will continue working for the number of years it takes for that to happen. And that's why you have to have strong disability organizations, strong disability leaders who understand what needs to be done and who can get the tools.
So over the years, you've worked with disability NGOs in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Colombia, Georgia, Lebanon, Iraq, Morocco, Uzbekistan, and so many more, funded by USAID and or the State Department. What tools could help you make doing these types of work easier? Either you or other future individuals with disabilities who would like to follow in your footsteps? What is the key to collaborating with people internationally on issues of inclusion and equal opportunity?
Today, there's a lot of laws, international laws, and regulations that are in place. These are tools that we can work with and utilize to attempt changes in whatever country you want to work in. So for people today who want to do this kind of work, I think you've got an interest internationally for what is the world out there like, and what can I do? What do I do in that world when I go out into it? If you want to get involved in international work, you have to start participating in international meetings and getting to know people in other countries, learning their experiences and what's different between an American experience and a disabled person in another country. And it's Europeans, disabled people and leaders are very different than American disabled leaders. And
how are they different?
They're because of the experience they had growing up in Europe. Europe and America went in different directions when back in the 80s and the 90s. The disability rights movement in America is based on the rule of law, and America is pretty unique in the world. I mean, that doesn't mean it's the only one. It just means there aren't that many countries that operate on the rule of law. If you pass a law, you pass a regulation, the society and its institutions and its employees and its agencies and so forth are required to implement those rules and those laws. That is a huge benefit to work in a country where laws and regulations are meant to be implemented, and you have the rest of society, not everyone, but a lot of them, working to support your human rights and your access in society. That does not exist in other countries. It is, if it's Nicaragua, not so much at all. If it's Russia, not so much at all. If it's Iraq, not at all. It's like the differences in these countries for how they work with rules and laws, if they're very weak and not enforced, you are so much more vulnerable, so much more isolated, because you do not have the support of your society, its rules, and its laws.
Very enlightening. So in terms of moving on to dance now, a totally different topic here, an aspect of your life. How did you get involved with dancing?
This is a radical shift in our conversation because dancing is not dancing as a disabled person, dancing as a quadriplegic is not what most disabled people think about. My own journey of wanting to learn how to dance came from personal desire. I asked myself at one point in my life, in the mid '80s or so, while I was doing all this international work and so forth. I mean, I've not been very happy watching people in wheelchairs dance. It always looked very clumsy. And I'm sorry for my judgment about it, but it looked clumsy, as a clumsy attempt to mirror what able-bodied people do when they dance. And it seemed to me that there was no way with my body and my paralyzed body in a wheelchair, I was going to be able to dance like able-bodied people dance. And I saw other people in wheelchairs trying to dance. Pretty much the attempt by people in wheelchairs is to do ballroom dance, because there is more opportunity to do ballroom type dancing in a wheelchair than other kinds of dancing forms. So I was not impressed. I just not been impressed with ballroom dancing in a wheelchair. It just didn't excite me. And most of the dancing that happens in the world by able-bodied people is choreographed dancing. And choreographed dancing means that you figure out how to do a particular dance, you memorize all of the movements, and then you just keep practicing it over and over and over until it is perfection. And then you show it. So you have to be doing the same movements exactly the same every time. That didn't suit my personality either. I live in a body that doesn't do things repeatedly the same way. And I think lots of disabled people will relate to that. It's very difficult to do the exact same movement exactly the same way when you're in a wheelchair or you have a paralyzed body. So I kept asking myself the question, how does someone who has a paralyzed body in a wheelchair dance? And I kept asking myself that question, and I didn't have an answer. I didn't see it in the world around me. So I didn't have a solution, so I just left it alone for years. Didn't have an answer, so I didn't do anything about it. I then had an experience while I was on a I was on a demonstration. It was a huge demonstration of like 250, 300 international people who were marching for peace in Central America. This was in the mid '80s when there were lots of wars in Central America, and I had been working in Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador. I was very aware of these wars in Central America, and I joined with a peace march that traveled overland for several months from Panama to Mexico City through Central America to promote peace in the region. And while I was on that journey, which is a whole amazing story by itself, of experiences of living on the street in different countries in a march of a couple hundred people in a wheelchair. I was the only person in a wheelchair in the group, of course. And I did it because I wanted to see if I could. It's like, can I do this? I wanted to, but could I do it? I didn't know. So I tried it out. And in the middle of that experience, during a time we were stopped and resting in a coffee plantation in the mountains of Nicaragua, a friend of mine said, "Hey, do you want to dance? Because we're just all exhausted. We're just, we want to do something for fun." And we stopped at a coffee plantation where there's these cement. Think of it like large areas of cement where they dry the coffee. And for me, I saw those large areas of cement as an opportunity to easily move around in my wheelchair instead of struggling with the road. And so I said, well, okay, I've got a cassette, some music. Let's put some music on and we'll play with it. I was skeptical, but I was willing to do it. And I was shocked at how that person related to my body and my movements in a wheelchair. It was so much easier to figure out how to dance or how to move together with that person. And I said, why? I asked them, why are you able to move like this with me? Thinking it was like some personal experience or something. And they said, oh, well, I practice a particular dance form. It's called contact improvisation. And it's improvisation. It's not choreographed. That means you just go from physical movement to physical movement to physical movement, improvising. And you learn how to communicate through your body physically, through touch, through listening through touch to another person, and through other ways to communicate together. And you create a dance from that conversation that you have between two people physically in the world. And this was explained to me, and I was just fascinated. And as soon as I got back home from that experience a couple months later, I went in search of a dance teacher who taught contact improvisation. And I had to convince that dance teacher, here I am in a wheelchair, I want to learn how to do this. And they looked at me and they go, okay, let's do it. They don't know how to do it, but they were willing to try. And from that beginnings became a career of learning how to dance using contact improvisation techniques with other people, able-bodied people, and have an experience in that dance where there is equality between the two bodies. I had never experienced equality physically between me and my paralyzed body in a wheelchair and an able-bodied people. I never experienced equality that way, where I make decisions equally with them. How do we move? What do we do? How do we communicate that? Do we go quick, slow, listening to each other this way? And I developed my skills doing this over several years. And I realized at that time I wanted to stop doing the international work and learn how to dance. And I focused my life at learning how to dance, and then eventually becoming a teacher of this form of dancing to able-bodied people, and then eventually teaching them how to dance with other disabled people of all kinds of disabilities. I learned that it doesn't matter what your disability was. This was my new vision.
How has dancing helped you accept and embrace your identity, your body, and how others view you?
My experience that I was just describing really strengthened my self-confidence. I already was confident. I was already traveling internationally and training other people. There wasn't a lack there. But like I said, it changed me because it gave me more of a human connection experience with disabled people and able-bodied people. So it broke down some more barriers that keeps us separate from other human beings, and whether they're disabled or whether they're able-bodied. It allowed me to see myself as a creative person in creating dance as a form of public communication.
I think to learn about this aspect of your life is absolutely very fascinating, because just the contrast of the two, it's almost like you had two different lives, two different careers.
It is two different lives, two different careers. But that's normal, I think, for human beings. Some human beings do one thing and do it all their lives. Some human beings, have a couple of different careers. They start off with one career and then jump to a different career. So I did the same thing.
Well, I think with that's a wrap, unless you had any last words of wisdom or any last words you wanted to end with?
I'm an older person now. I'm in my late 60s and with a very full life. Very happy with my life, what I've done with it, what I've accomplished, what I've experienced, both the hardships, the difficulties, and the joys of it. So I'm very satisfied with my life, but I'm concerned, like many other disabled leaders of my age are now, who went through the 70s and the 80s, creating our civil rights and our human rights. We're worried and concerned about the younger people who carries the torch going forward, who is motivated to pick up this work and continue deepening it and spreading it, both in the United States, which has lots of work yet to be done, both new areas and defending what has already been won. Where are the young leaders? They are there. They are coming up. I'm a little dismayed that so many are choosing to just have an enjoyable life. I'm not criticizing them because everybody wants to just live their life. And in America, many disabled people have that opportunity. Whereas when I was growing up, you have to fight for it. You fight now, but not as hard. I don't, I'm not saying to people you can't just go and enjoy your life, but we do need people to become leaders and to practice being leaders in order to defend what has been already won. There are no guarantees that it will always be this way. People should not just take it for granted what we have. We have to constantly, go out and struggle and defend what we have.
Well, those are very, very what's the word I'm looking for? It's definitely a wake-up call to hear from you, and as someone who's done so much work and gone the miles and seen how it's changed over time and what it's been like around the world. And so thank you for that. I think that we've learned a lot from you today, all the insights that you've shared. And
thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of my life and my experiences.
Of course.
It's very minor, but I'm happy to share it.
Of course. Thank you.